Terry Jones, welcome to Show Studio. I'm going to start with asking you what you think you've done and who you think you are, because I think over your career you've had a consistently very important role in magazines, but I think some people would say Terry's an art director, that's always what he's been, that's what he is. But then other people, obviously your team at ID perhaps, who worked there when you were there, would say that you're an editor-in-chief. What do you think you've done?
I think I've empowered people to capitalize on their talent, and I think that was part of the aim when, with ID, but even, I guess I was learning before ID, and so when I started ID, the idea was that there was people with a lot of talent or a lot of skills, and they should just capitalize on what they could do. And sometimes people didn't know what they could do, but they, ended up doing it really, really well.
So it's not about your talent, it's about other people's talent?
Sometimes I've described myself like a mirror. So it's funny because one of my early jobs was designing books, and I wasn't a very good, at school I was really rubbish. I mean, chemistry and science was my worst subject. But I ended up working for a guy called Ivan Dodd, who had a project for Nuffield, doing Nuffield books. And one of my early books that I designed in his studio was on catalyst. It was a chemistry book for 12-year-olds. And I had no idea what a catalyst was. But through doing the book, I learned that catalyst is something which makes things happen by putting two things together. And I think sometimes I see myself like that. I'm a catalyst. So if I meet up with someone, I have no idea what they can do. But I try and find out, and then I'd see myself as a mirror, and I say I can double what they can do. So it's like double people's skills.
It's interesting because a lot of the people who I've spoken to who've worked with you, sort of way back when, people like Nick Knight, but also more recently, they talk about how you become incredibly close to the people you work with, and it's almost like a family. So it's interesting what you just said then, because I wonder, when you meet someone, do you work with them because you think they're talented, or do you work with them because you like them?
It's really, I think there's a chemistry, but I think also there's an energy. I think, marrying Trish, where we met sort of like we were, really young, we were sort of students, but that was a kind of chemistry, so it was something which grew, and I think that energy and that kind of family atmosphere grew partly because we started ID in our house. So, prior to that, I think that if I got on with someone, or if photographers wise, for instance, that they became like family. Toscani used to come and stay in our house when he was working at at Vogue. I would have the photographers I wanted to work with, Alex Chatelain or Arthur Algort. They would stay in the top of our house. So they were like family at the point where Trish and I were just beginning our family. And so having meals at night around the kitchen table or breakfast in the morning was like a family affair. And so growing up with those photographers was part of life. And I guess seeing work and family and life all come together was something which I was kind of privileged, but took it for granted in a way.
So would you say that it's when you've been hiring people or seeking new people out, you recruit them in a more sort of, I guess with more consideration, than you're not just thinking, oh, I'm going to be your boss, you need to come work for me, you're thinking you're going to be a member of my family. I guess there's much more investment.
Yeah, it's more like if you feel the energy of the person and you like the person, then they stay. If you have, I think there's something which Trish was really good at, is managing people better than I was. I'd say that I wasn't so good at always encouraging people in a positive way. I would be, I suppose, quite critical and expect people to do better, and I think Trish would balance it out. So I think that was a very fortunate part of our relationship, and I think that when people came in, I had no idea what their abilities were, so I generally just give them a pencil or just say, well, what can you do? I wasn't so interested in seeing a portfolio.
Okay. Let's talk about your sort of earliest life. Do you remember when you were a child? Were you obsessed with design? Were you obsessed with magazines? What were your interests?
No, not at all. I getting into magazines or getting into art anyway, was serendipitous. The school I went to was a school for single-parent children, so that I was put into care and ended up because my mother was in hospital. So I had no idea what art was, and the most contemporary artist I'd heard of at school was Van Gogh. So coming out of school at 16, and that was pure chance, because I should have probably gone into the forces. They thought that would be a nice, safe occupation.
Yeah.
But I'd written to my mother in Bristol, and she found out that there was an interview for commercial art students in Bristol at the West of England College of Art, and I had a day to get my portfolio together to go for an interview. And as the school didn't keep work, they destroyed it. I actually had to produce 6 pieces of work that night, and they wanted to see 12, and I managed to scrape together 9. I had 3 from school, and somehow got into this commercial arts course. So it was serendipitous, really. And I had no idea what commercial art was. There wasn't. Nobody had sort of said, "Oh, this is a job possibility." But learning by going there, and over the years, I think I got very, very lucky with people I met who, in a way, mentored what I wanted to do.
But why that course? Why not something else? As you said, you could just as easily have...
I didn't know the difference, to be honest. I didn't know the difference between fine art and commercial art. It was just that in the first year, I learned how to paint lettering with a 6-inch, with a 6-point type with a brush.
Yeah.
Put down paint flat, choose coloured. It was really like a course for doing chocolate boxes and cigarette packs. And I realised that wasn't what I wanted to do. So after a year, I stopped going into the college, except to use the facility for doing silkscreen. Well, we weren't even allowed to do the print area, so we actually created our own silkscreen. So I was only interested in things which were printed, and I was fortunate enough there was a tutor who taught how to take a picture frame and make a silkscreen out of that. And that was my sort of first bit of education.
Yeah, talk to me about your tutors and your influences, because it's been quite widely written about in interviews with you how important Richard Hollis was to you and to sort of inspiring you.
He was brilliant, yeah. Well, he came, my course was 2 years, so the first course I finished, by then I was editing the student magazine. It had sort of, it wasn't running before, but I'd got interested in, as I say, things which were printed. So I decided to become the editor of the college magazine, and then in that I did a thing called Hip Hip Bullshit Dip, which they'd just got diploma status. They were very pleased they were getting diploma status, and because I'd not been part of the system, I did a typical student sort of thing, and then got called up. They were going to throw me out, and I was a union representative for the graphics department, and there was only 3 of us that ever turned up to a union meeting, so I called a strike. And at that time, everyone was worried in colleges because Hornsey had a strike, and we were going to do a planned sit-in, and the principal called me up and said, "Look, if I censored the word bullshit, I could stay." And so I learned about black on black. I recalled, I don't know what the print run was, but I got a hold of 500 magazines that we blacked out bullshit. And the same year they threw out Richard Long. So
were you ambitious or were you rebellious?
No, I think I was just naive.
Okay.
I think that it was such a difference between coming out of a uniform type school and then, my friends were bikers or greasers, and at that time, there were jazz clubs in Bristol, and so I'd hang out, and I grew my hair, so my hair was kind of got long, and I was between what was going on then was bikers or rockers and mods and beats, and so the friends on the estate where I grew up were the bikers, and then in town you'd get the mods, and at college I was reasonably tolerated, but I didn't look like a graphic student. I looked like a fine art student, I suppose. What
do you mean?
Well, in those days, students that did graphics were meant to kind of wear, tidier clothes, and I used to cycle in and get oil on my jeans and wipe my brushes, and I was, I suppose, rebelling from a uniform, and I think that was a point where ID formulated about identity.
What were you rebelling against? It's interesting what you said about sort of, the school you went to and growing up. Did you always feel a kind of sense of angst a little bit when you were young?
Not really. I think when you're at school, you try and find your own way. So I always wear the jacket two sizes too big, or I'd turn my tie up so I'd had the thin side rather than the wide side showing. And so those are things which you kind of find your own way. And so as soon as having the freedom where I could choose whatever I was going to do for my wardrobe within whatever I could afford. And it was, at the time when you sat in a bath to shrink your jeans.
Tell me more about, if you're comfortable doing so, it's interesting what you were saying about your own family and how you grew up sort of in quite a lonely way. Do you think that's what's made you have such an interest in kind of growing a family professionally around you?
It's not something I've ever thought about as a reason, but I suspect that it may have had. In one way, it would be contradictory, because the schools I was in, they were boarding schools, so you'd have tons of kids in the same situation. Well, I mean, there was 150 kids, I suppose, in the school, and then coming back to the estate in the holidays, it again was gangs. We were part of the French mob, and so the French mob was sort of the junior league bikers, and Bristol's Seven Hill city, and so there would always be confrontations between one territory and another, and I think that I always found that stupid, that there were always this kind of rivalry, and that it was a way of actually breaking down those rivalries. And I think that when ID started, it was actually about breaking down the whole uniform, and that you'd be able to kind of mix it up much more. And so the ethos of ID at the beginning was to break down the categories, so that you couldn't be defined exactly. That if somebody saw what you were wearing, and you might have had a button, or you might have had the way you turned up your trousers, or the shoes you would choose, those little signals would give some indication of things which were much more subtle than wearing your school uniform. Sure. Or I thought it was brilliant, through the 60s, when Caroline Baker started using military clothes at the time of Vietnam, and they started breaking down what that represented, because then it was, it had been adopted by skinheads, but then it was suddenly being worn by a whole fashion conscious or gay community. So those sort of breaking downs of the language and mixing it up interested me a lot.
That's interesting. It's because you talk about kind of ideas if it's always been something you've done, which I guess it was, because from what you say, it was born so much out of these kind of things that you'd always thought and always felt. But there was an interesting period in your career pre-ID that I want to ask you about, because tell me about when you left college and you started thinking about having a job, because you kind of quite famously worked for British Vogue, but tell me about some of the first positions you had and what your ambitions were at that point. Well,
again, Bristol was a provincial town, and I was moving up to London. I quit college before finishing the course, so I thought that nobody in London would have time to see me. But there was Hollis, Rich Hollis was amazing at bringing very interesting lecturers in, and so as part of the degree course, there were people like Froschag and I can't remember all the names of people he brought there, but there was one guy, Ken Campbell, was a really good typographer, and he gave me a list of design studios to go and visit, and so I photocopied 5 pieces of work. It was actually a PMT machine in those days, and did PMTs of the work, and then made 10 portfolios or folders, which I sent around to the 10 studios, and said I was coming up to London. I would be ringing up and then turn up at their door. And in those days, you had to use coin boxes. I mean, nobody had mobile phones, and but the letter that I'd sent had pre-warned that I was going to call. I ended up getting 50 interviews in a week and offered 3 jobs by the end of the week. And Ivan had checked me out with Ken, saying, was I mad because he couldn't understand anyone who'd spent 4 years at college, sending up, 5 pieces of A4, black and white, as a representing 4 years' work, and gave me this job, and I thought I was together with Trish by then, but I said I would work with him for a year, and then after a year I was still there, and it went on for 3 years, and it was because I was still learning, and he still let me make mistakes, and I think that was such a foundation, being able to make mistakes and learn from a typographic master. And then it was serendipitous, I moved on to magazines, and Vogue was similarly separate. It was a chance of going into Vogue.
What did you learn when you were at Vogue?
Not to take things too seriously.
Do they take things too seriously?
I think because for the first 6 months, I really thought I was in the wrong job.
Yeah.
I'd taken over from Barney One, who was immaculate, wore Saint Laurent, and with lunch at San Lorenzo and Mr. Chow, and I kind of tried to emulate that a little bit by buying a Saint Laurent shirt and a Cerruti suit, but it wasn't my uniform, so I ended up, wearing worker jackets and worker boots, and felt much more comfortable, and so and decided to have fun. So after the first 6 months, I then decided to have fun and try and break some of the rules. And B. Miller was amazing and let me get away with all sorts of breaking rules. Covers notoriously.
Green jelly is amazing. That's my favorite.
I mean, the green jelly one, that was one they tried to take off. Well, Daniel Salian tried to take off the press, but it was already on, and Bernie Laser, who was the British managing director at the time, had okayed it because it had gone through this kind of panel. Each cover had to be checked by B. Miller, myself, and the distribution manager. So once we voted that would be okay, we didn't ask anyone else. And Lieberman at the time was having his own problems in America, so I'd never had to even show Lieberman what I was doing.
How often did that happen where you had to kind of deal with people taking issue with your work or saying that you couldn't do something that you thought would be really great? Are there lots of things in your memory that should have been on the cover of Vogue that weren't?
Yes, because you have to. I'd learned that before at Vanity Fair.
Yeah,
you win one, you lose one. I mean, it's like, even if you win less, if you got one per year, it was amazing. But I think with Beatrice, she was. I don't know. I had to think about her recently. Because they did a memorial service for her, and I just have to thank her for so much that she let me get away with. I a habit of chopping heads, and
no eyes.
I think, you know, the upside down cover, you know, Bailey and I got on really well, and I think from the historic group of photographers that were there, Bailey was the one that was kind of most encouraging, because he was so mischievous, and the fact that, you know, we were able to get away with stuff that he hadn't been able to get away with for 10 years before. It was a breath of fresh air.
That's interesting, because I was talking, I did a bit of research and I was talking to people that used to work with you, and a couple of people said that part of the reason you left Vogue was photographers, people like Bailey, who were kind of making real specifications about how their work had to be presented. Is that not the case?
No, what happened was that
there's also
there was a period where, you know, because when I started in magazines, the art director had absolute control. You know, so you get a set of pictures and you get boxes and boxes of photographs. Like Horvath, who was again a brilliant photographer I learned from, would shoot 10 rolls per outfit, 36mm, all, you know, with natural on Kodachrome, and I'd go through, you know, spend hours going through stuff. And I get eye strain. And when you know, it's natural, you get eye strain for going through stuff for 3 days to get a choice. But I'd go through every single shot, and that was the norm. You know, 35mm was the norm. So by the time I got to Vogue and I was looking at pictures of people like Latigan and Clive Arrowsmith, they were shooting 2 1/4, and so you only had 12 per sheet. But it was still a lot of film you would go through. And then you'd work out the bit you wanted. So I would mark up the pictures and automatically order 3 sizes of each image, and it would come down from the studio, and then I'd mark my crop. So in those days, you know, I was cropping whatever I got. Even Newton, I think Bourdain, we were told not to crop too much, but you know, even there, it was like the art director had absolute control. And I think that at some point I got interested in Polaroid when SX70 came out, and I thought, brilliant, you know, you get SX70 and you're going to be able to see right away what you want, don't have to go through tons of choices. I just had to convince the printers that you could print SX70. So we did a test with a Bailey shoot, and I didn't blow it up to bleed. It was a striptease story with Marie Helvin, and they complained like hell because they said, you know, you can't reproduce it. Turned out brilliantly, but not the quality that they expected, because normally they expect to see things as a tranny, and they would have control on their scan. And this way it was much more illustrative, and the tones were different. And after that, I ended up doing a cover with Toscani, which I'd found that the red was more dominant. You could kind of get a red saturation. Greens weren't so good, and if you wound it up, you could increase the highlights. So we did this cover, and tiny bit of retouching where the flash had burnt out between the eyes, but it ended up being a really big seller. So then from there, it was the idea of getting less choice. So trying to get photographers shooting on plate camera, and bit by bit, you know, the control and the formatting shifted towards the photographer having the final say on the crop. But I guess that was an era that, you know, today most people working in the business would not dream of chopping the photographer without the photographer's permission.
Yeah, I don't think Nick would respond too kindly if that happened today.
He always kind of encouraged me, but he kind of, I guess, you know, even like an Iraqi, in ID Japan, I wanted to slash up the Iraqi, you know, and it was a transparency, and all of the studio, my assistants in Japan said, "Oh no, we can't do that." I said, "No, you can do it, because you know, they have really good skill that they would not." So I called up Iraqi studio and I said, "Look, are you okay if I cut up the picture because it was a little bit boring. The picture was a bit boring. And the great thing getting boring pictures is you can chop the hell out of them. So, or you can make them more interesting by chopping them. And so I got, snapped a razor blade and just cut it up. That's what I used to do with typography when I was working for Ivan. Is that, the days that headlines were done, my first job was just taking the space out between the letters.
Tell me more a little bit about that period at Vogue. I want to ask about another aspect to what was going on and what was exciting you beyond just toying with the work itself, which was the bigger movements, because punk was something that fascinated you, wasn't it? And it was something that they perhaps didn't cover. It was
more, at Vogue, you got into a kind of repetitive, you knew what was going to happen. You knew you were going to do colour issues twice a year. They would have colour themes, so you'd end up doing that twice a year. You knew that the Christmas issue was the one you could have most fun with, and punk was happening on the streets in London. So I had this young photographer come to see me, a guy called Steve Johnston, and he was out of Carlisle, and he had a nice set of photographs, landscapes and sheep and stuff that he'd done up in Carlisle. And I said, and he'd never make a living doing that, but on King's Road there was so much going on. Just do head to toes, because when I was a student growing up in the 60s, someone had documented what was going on in the 60s, they'd have a really good record. So he went off and came back after 3 months, showed me these head to toe. Toscani was a big fan of Olga Sander, so fashion-wise we'd often done these head to toe portraits. And I said to Steve, just go off and do head to toes, 2 clicks per person, treat it like a plate camera. And so he came back and showed me his contacts, and on each contact he'd have like at least 16 people that looked brilliant. So I thought that would be great for Vogue, and B. Miller came in, and I hadn't realized how much Steve had changed in 3 months, because he suddenly had dyed his hair orange, he was wearing a jacket with safety pins, he had swastika on his forehead, and she looked in and she just saw him as one of these guys she'd been reading about in the Daily Mirror, and walked out. She couldn't kind of enter the discussion. And so I realized that Vogue, was such an institution, it couldn't recognize what was going on the streets. Sandra Rhodes at the same time was doing was inspired to do her punk collection, and I tried to actually make that one of my last covers, was a headline, "What a rip-off."
Do you feel, when you look at British Vogue today, I think, whenever you work somewhere, it becomes a part of you in a way, and you always feel really attached to it. When you look at British Vogue, do you feel like it's you in any way?
No. It was funny going back, because I hadn't been back into Vogue until, with B's memorial. And it was such a different world. I see it as, part of my past. Yeah. But when I pick up the magazine, I'll flip through it. It's the same way as I might flip through any other magazine. But what's interesting is that I'll see lots of photographers who started their careers now working for ID, and that's nice to see.
Yeah.
But
do you think it's a good magazine?
Do I think it's a good magazine? I think it could be better.
Okay, let's talk about that period when you left, because did you leave, when you decided to leave, did you think, I'm going to leave to start my own magazine, or was it more pragmatic and more confused than that? Did you just know you needed to leave but you weren't quite sure what you were going to do? Because you had the Fiorucci time.
Yeah, I think the idea of doing a magazine myself happened around 76. I was wanting to do a newspaper. Okay. And there was a newspaper in New York that I'd been inspired by, which was called, I can't remember what it's called. It was a newspaper anyway. And I started a thing called Picture Wallpaper. And the idea was that you create a newspaper that you could plaster your walls with, so that it would just be images, and it was cheap or free, and each time it was a way of that you could decorate your room cheaply, and I couldn't get the funding for it. And after a while, I thought, well, if I end up doing this, why am I doing it? Because it's such a lot of effort and distribution and stuff. Anyway, the ID I felt was a valid kind of fanzine. Fanzines were starting, and Caroline Baker was a friend who knew Jolly, and who was a fanzine printer in Portobello Road. And so I asked him would he print it, and he had an A4 printer. He'd never done colour, and he said, well, he'd print and I would buy copies from him. And so I'd met, when doing this punk book, that was something that came out of the Steve Johnson thing, I did a punk book, I met Alex McDowell, and he had a studio in Berwick Street, and I'd helped him do something with rich kids. And we kicked around names, and ID was the name of my company, Instant Design, or initials of Instant Design, or Informat Design, I was then. And Trish said, yeah, that's the title, ID. And so it just started really as a hobby.
Talk to me more about that design, because I think we talked a bit about it, but I want to talk more about your this idea of instant design. And did you, when you started ID, was it about the content or was it about the design? Because if you read things about ID, there's so much that, it was started because you fell in love with street style, it started because you adored punk, but was it just because you loved design? I sort of studied as a designer, and in fact it was Hollis who said, you're information designer. So as a student, I used to call myself Informat Design, and that's on the kind of posters I did. So Informat Design was what I'd play around with and that became my first studio. And I think it was just the idea of moving imagery and typography together. The type on an image added something, the word together with an image. So you can have an image and then you can stick a word with it or words with it, and you can give it a different meaning. So that combination always interested me. And even at Vogue, I would bang type through the middle of images, sometimes upsetting photographers doing it, but I like this kind of physical imposition of type on an image, and that it was not too precious, and that's something which, as a kind of process, I grew up with. And so when it came to doing ID, it was setting up a kind of set of rules, if you like, which the image would come in and then we'd get the words. And I wasn't interested in journalism as such, I just wanted the words to come from the person you saw. So it's like you walk up to someone and say, well, what's your interest? And then they tell you your interests and you get those down. So in the process of doing that, we would look for things where it was about meeting a mate in a way. It was about the idea that you in an unknown town, you wanted to go somewhere and you see someone you think, I'd like to find out where they go. And that was the kind of principle at the beginning. The straight up.
The straight up, yeah.
It's interesting what you say, that you weren't that precious about journalism, or I guess kind of this idea of the imagery and the words and how they came together in quite a haphazard way, because I think this idea of controlled chaos is very interesting with your work. And I was chatting to a few people who did work with you that period, and Nick Knight told me some great stories about you deliberately mixing captions up on his pictures. So he'd have shot, when he was doing his sort of skinhead period, he'd have shot some great big bouncer, and then you'd put a caption that was some cute little girl who was interested in poetry on it. And Dylan Jones told me a story about how your approach to sub-editing, you just cut the bottom off an article if it didn't fit.
Yeah. Well, it's the same like photographers, if you can't get the head in, and chop the head.
Was there an element, because you were laughing when I'm telling you about it, was there an element where you you realised it was playful? Because there must have been an element where it wasn't just about the design. It wasn't like you were so obsessed with the design that you didn't even care about the text and that's why you were cutting it off. There must have been something slightly more, which was this idea of deliberately being a little bit subversive.
It's also, I think it's quite important that you don't give the whole story. I think, people, they think if they look up Wikipedia, they're getting the whole story. I mean, what they're doing is having an edit, and sometimes that edit isn't true. And I think that with communication today, you can't, you've got to do your own studies. You've got to create your own opinions. And if your opinion is coming from secondhand information, it's a bit like readers' research. We'd always been told. Well, I think the first time I came across readers' research was when I was hauled up for doing a Vanity Fair cover, where the girl was looking down and there was a dark patch between her legs, and they said never do it again. And then showed me how Glamour, did their covers with readership research on what things are. That research has been analysed. It's going to be 6 months old, So all that stuff about readers' research takes away gut instinct, and I think gut instinct is something which you have to develop. Instinct is something which you have to develop. So you start reacting on your personal instincts and make judgments on your personal instincts. So that's the thing which I think has been taken away by everything being kind of sanitized and going through a process of rules.
But you must have, it's interesting you talk about starting ID sort of in your own home, but there must have been a period where you yourself had to start, ID has become a big part of fashion institution, and before it was kind of about people who were interested in fashion, then it became about fashion. And did you find that period where you yourself started to kind of play those rules and present things in a way that people expected them to be seen?
Yeah, at the point where, I guess in those early days, we really broke all the rules. Perfecting the art of illegibility and things like that, which was something where the idea of doing headlines where you'd scribble them out but then have to give subtitles was part of the fun of actually slowing people down. The idea that you have a magazine every 4 months, or 3 months, it was a quarterly, that you still can discover something after 3 months rather than actually consuming things fast. And I think that was an idea intentionally brought into the design process. And that things have layers, so the idea of layering things which get peeled away was again part of a design idea that was became a style. So it was stretching the technology that we had available, but it was before the days of computers and Photoshop. And I think creating certain limitations is a good thing, because the number of decisions you're going to make are enormous anyway. People come into the art department, I'd say, well, you can only use Universe, which was my pet hate from college. And so for years, we just used Universe and distorted it.
Tell me a little bit about some of the people that you champion, because it's really, really amazing when you think about some of the people that did work for ID, even someone like Nick Knight, and people in the industry are very, there's a huge amount of warmth towards yourself and Trisha, and people say, I wouldn't be where I am without Terry Jones. Like Dylan always says that. And what was it that made you inclined to take a punt on people?
I guess I just felt lucky myself, and I was just really lucky to have people like Hollis and Ivan, and I think that it's this thing where walking through one door rather than another, can change your life. So I think that if you have someone who comes in and is prepared to graft, and then in that process they learn, it's a reward just to see that process where you see someone develop. It's not to say that I didn't have people I fell out with. I'm sure that there's going to be people you'd find I've fallen out with, but but I think on the whole, the energy vibe that you get between people, it's kind of a human relationship, and I think that that's something which generated itself. I always find it interesting when we ever did an ID night, or even around the world we do these ID nights, and I was amazed that wherever we did them, they always felt like they were the same party. It was like that it generated the same type of people, whether it was in Beijing or Hong Kong or New York or London. That it attracted people who, I suppose, are always out there with a freedom to find a way of expressing themselves, because they don't necessarily fit into the norm. And then speaking to people who, decided to become a fashion designer because they found ID, they just, the fact that the energy kind of translated, I find that is maybe the most satisfying thing of creating it. And the fact that it continues, because I haven't sort of been involved for a year, but it continues with a team that were not born when we started. I think that's great too.
It's interesting thinking about that passage of time, and also the influence that ID has had on people. That's interesting because you speak to a lot of people where they talk about the kind of really early issues. Do you think that ID had a heyday in any respect? Was it better at any point?
I think what's really interesting is that it happens so often that people would pick up ID and they say, "Oh, this is the best issue," and it happened over and over. Like every year, you'd sort of find someone say, "Oh, that's brilliant." And I think that was the thing about being a mirror of the moment and try to catch that zeitgeist of the moment. I guess commerce has interfered with that a lot, because obviously the first 10 years. The commerce was completely different. In the first 5 years, I ran up enough debt to have to go into partnership.
Yeah, it's interesting that, isn't it? I think that goes back to what I was kind of asking before about the element of giving up freedom in a way. Was it ever frustrating working on ID, those points where you thought, oh, but we used to be able to do it like this? Have you ever found that hard to kind of start playing? Because, having advertisers and working with those sort of commercial restrictions that any title has and increasingly gets, I think.
I think it was a very fortunate time, but obviously it was subsidised by me doing commercial work.
Yeah.
It was like a hobby job. So the picture that I gave you was done when I was working for Esprit, and it's, Doug Tompkins wanted 90% of my time. So that was a point where Nick stepped in and took over doing the art direction. So I think that over different periods in its life, ID has reflected that moment, whether it's the commercial restrictions or the fact it's online it's become more and more important today. Yet one can get nostalgic about the past, but the physical limitations of what we were doing at the beginning are totally different to today. And maybe there will be a return to that. There may be, in this way that you're getting young DJs using vinyl, they're going back to doing limited editions of vinyl. I think that may be a relevance today.
Let's go back. It's interesting you just mentioned nostalgia, and I'm going to be really nostalgic now because I want to go back to that point where you did start ID. And I do want to talk about, because obviously the street is something that people talk about with ID constantly, but tell me about that time, just walking around London and being around at that period. It must have been so just kind of like immersively exciting.
I felt London's got this energy, at any time. I think that coming to London in the 60s, you could feel the energy of the place. I think that now, we drove up from Wales yesterday, and the pace is completely different than when you come into London. You see everyone kind of hustling and bustling, and so I think that big groups of people create an energy, and I think that if you can tap into that energy, then that's what we did, when we started the magazine. But obviously it was different from now, but I think that it's probably more creative now than it was then.
Why do you say that?
Because there's so many more people involved. You know, at that time, people coming out of college had no idea whether they were going to survive as a fashion designer. Nowadays, you get, I don't know, 300 people coming out of St Martin's or whatever it is, and most of them are going to get a job in some kind of creative industry. I think when I came out of college, and there were 20 of us in the course, I'm probably the only one that got a job. The others went to the post office or milkman or, you know.
It's interesting, you talked about luck before, but why you? Why have you succeeded? And I was going to ask this as well about ID, because you can look at that period where ID was developing, 1980 onwards, and titles like The Face isn't here anymore. You're still here, ID's still here. Why have you been so successful?
It has to be with the people that are involved. It's like I think that there was a purity in the idea. Identity obviously is kind of like something that goes on forever. So there was beyond the facade, and I think that The Face was about the facade. I think that it was a brilliant magazine, but I think that they tried to set the rules. ID didn't. So I think that the fact that we encompassed such a diverse range and actually wanted to promote diversity, promote that you could do it your own way, and I think that attracted certain types of people to work for it, and continues to do. And I think that Trish always talks about the tortoise and the hare, and that, we were the tortoise. And I think that as a kid, I used to like running, and long distance running was something which is about stamina and kind of pacing yourself. But I think at the end it's determination. So you feel that you're on a roll, like a big snowball. You keep pushing a snowball along.
Did you ever think about closing it down?
Periodically, yeah. When I had to remortgage my house a few times. But yeah, I mean, we were just very lucky with the partnerships we had. I mean, Tony Elliott was brilliant because he gave us a lot of freedom, but also structure. Obviously, Ferrucci at the time when I was going to stop, but I was art directing for Ferrucci, and that was just in the early days. So he came in for the year that I might not have continued. That was.
What stopped you from closing it down? Was it because you still believed in the idea, or was it because you had the family of people working around you?
I don't. I think there was always this sort of thing that it was possible to keep going, and I think that it once it entered the mainstream and sort of mainstream consciousness, it was able to kind of it was respected by advertising. There was a kind of decision. It was around after our 15th birthday issue, and we had an advertising manager who almost bankrupted us. I then had to stop doing my commercial work, and that was quite a critical point. And I said to Trish, we're going to have to embrace the fashion industry to do this, and we're going to have to produce something which they feel they can be part of. So that's when we elevated the fashion content, and it elevated the people that we were getting working for us, and I think their energy kind of keeps on. And that's what's amazing, is it's the energy that people put in.
Do you actually like fashion? Because you said before that fashion's kind of like it's provided, I think the phrase you used, it provided me with the excuse to do what I do.
Because I think it is a language. I mean, I chose to wear this jacket, which is kind of one of many that I used to wear at Vogue, and I think that the fact that you can create your own language, if you like, by what you choose to wear, is sometimes more communicative than language itself. And I like the theatre of fashion. So I like the fact that you can be blend, you can be disguised, or you can make a statement. and I think that that's something which fashion does really well.
Tell me, we talked just then about that kind of becoming part of the mainstream and starting to sort of play the game, as it were, and also the commercial kind of struggles that you had with ID. Tell me about the decision to sell to Vice. Was that very difficult?
It was timely. I think that that we knew that Kate and Matt were both successful photographers in their own right. They did not want the responsibility of running a magazine, and so and I'm going to be 70 next year. So I was past retirement age, and I didn't see myself kind of being an old fart trying to G up business, and the hustle of that. And Vice came to us, and two of the people that worked for us, and so and at the same year, two other people were interested in ID, and so it just seemed like we often throw up the balls in the air and see what comes down, and it kind of evolved without any research, and because the digital platform, we would have had to remortgage our house yet again to take it up to that level. They already had the infrastructure, so they were the ideal partner.
You say kind of throw the balls up and see what comes down. Do you like what's come down?
Yeah. Well, I like the fact that it's evolved and that so far they're managing it and they're taking care. That was our biggest concern, is that they would suddenly change it.
Do you have any personal ambitions that you're yet to fulfill?
It's given me time out to think about stuff that I've had in my head for ages. So,
like what?
Oh, that's still to happen, so I won't say until it happens.
I have one last question for you, which is, it's something that's kind of struck me in all your answers, back from when you were really small and you talked about your childhood kind of through till today. Do you think that creativity for you, it seems like it's always been a bit of an escape, kind of like something to do to take your mind off things, something that kind of...
I often sort of compare myself to like a plumber, where you've got a job to do and you've got to fix it. At the same time, if you could daydream, and I'd see, I often say my job description, what I do is I daydream. And I think that just being like a sponge where you're kind of aware of everything, it's like I've walked down the street and I'll see stuff, or I'm in the countryside and I'll sort of see the sky, the colours of the sky. I think just being aware of everything and appreciating that day is the most important, and that I feel such a privilege.
Terry Jones, thank you very much.